Ladies and gentlemen, do welcome to the next episode of my Safe Bet show, and it gives me an immense pleasure. It's an absolute privilege to welcome Dr. Jennifer Shatley, the Executive Director of Roga, the Responsible Online Gaming Association, on the show. Great to have you, Jen.
Thank you, Martin. It's nice to be here.
All the way from her husband's music den. Let's see if we get to talk about that. But first of all, if I may, I'd really like to talk to you about your university studies. Because one of the many things that caught my eye in your resume, or CV to use British parlance, was the plethora of degrees from a true variety of universities that you've got. They range from public policy to the good old English language. And as some folks might know, we've done some work together in the past. Hopefully we'll do some more in the future. So I've definitely witnessed you putting them all to a very good use. But in your own assessment, finally comes the question, which one of those degrees is the closest to your heart and which one you found to be the most useful one?
That's an interesting question, I will say. I think they all play a part, as you said, in sort of my unique perspective around responsible gaming, and they've all kind of shaped my career trajectory. I would say probably the one that's been most impactful would be the communications degree, which is very much based on research and statistics, because what I have tried to do throughout my career and now in Roga is really look at data-driven technologies, data-driven solutions, and really understand if what we're trying to put into place is effective. And so I'd say that one is probably the one that's been most useful for that perspective, but honestly, they all have... The funny thing is I actually thought I was going to be a lawyer first. I did go to law school too. However, I actually had to leave law school for unforeseen circumstances, but that's what led me into the master's degree in communications. So I kind of fell into where I think I belong.
I was a lawyer once, and look at me. So you've made the right choice, most definitely. We will come on to talk about Roga. Hopefully, let's see what Roga's got in store for us. Though I've also got to say that Jen's got her very able comms team behind the scenes, keeping an eye on me. So I will do my best not to try to lure out anything too confidential, because they might be cursing me. But if you were to turn back time, if that was ever possible, perhaps Mr. Musk will help us with that at some point, but you have pursued the same university curriculum, or with the benefit of all the hindsight, would you have done anything differently?
I think that I'm very happy with the path I took. I think what led me back, actually, I went back to university to get my doctorate as a non-traditional student. So I, just a few years ago, went back to get that public policy degree. And really my career is what led me to that. At the time, I was doing some consulting in Japan. And I was working a lot with the Diet, working a lot with government officials, and that really piqued my interest around public policy. I'd been in policy for a long time, more from an operator side, not really from the public policy government side. And so that led me to that role, which I think helps with what I'm trying to do within the industry, to understand responsible gaming from a lot of different perspectives. I've had an academic background as well, research background, industry background, public policy background. So they all bring a lot of different perspectives to look at responsible gaming in a different way. So I don't think I would change anything. I might have done it sooner than I did. And maybe the law school, maybe I would have finished that. But yeah, I think the path I took led me to where I am today, and I'm happy with that.
I'm delighted that you're happy. Not that many folks out there that could say that. So, and you've clearly come full circle, but let's go back to the beginning of your career story, if I may, because I presume in a lot of folks' mind, you're still rather firmly associated with what you've done at Caesars, where you ended up serving as the Vice President of Responsible Gaming Policies and Compliance. By the way, as a sidebar, and yeah, well, that's my job title as well. It's like I love these extremely long job titles that we all, now part of that ecosystem, we all in America tend to use. Anyway, Among many other things, you led the development, implementation, and administration of the company's RG programs. And as I started saying, you have scored a bunch of RG firsts, like first of its kind RG training or developing the role of responsible gaming ambassador, which prior to that simply had not existed. So would you tell us more about your time at Caesars and what motivated, what inspired all these awesome ideas?
So I had the privilege of working at Harrah's and Caesars, which was actually the company that created the very first responsible gaming policies in the industry back in 1989, before I joined. I don't want to age myself.
I'm sure, well before you did.
So they had a corporate culture already around responsible gaming, and really the genesis of why they created it in the first place was because the CEO at the time had experience with a customer who was a family friend that had experienced problems with gambling, and he saw the toll it took, and he understood as a responsibility that the industry should be doing something around this. So at the time, there wasn't a lot known about responsible gaming or problem gambling. So it was pretty basic what was put into place. It was kind of, if someone says, I have a gambling problem, you gave them a brochure and a helpline number, and that was kind of the extent of it. Fast forward to late 90s, early 2000s. We also, so again, Caesars, Harrah's at the time, implemented the first code of commitment, which was the first sort of ethical statement in the industry that said, this is how we're going to treat customers, employees, communities, and eventually environment. But it was basically CSR before CSR existed. And as part of that, that same CEO that had created the first RG program was going around to all properties and talking to employees about the importance of this and how we have to live this every day. And an interesting question came up from an employee that said, what if a guest doesn't come out and say they have a gambling problem, but they're making statements that makes it seem like gambling is causing problems in their life? And he said, we should not be doing business with that customer. So I was in the role of implementing this code of commitment, and I had to say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Do we do that? We did not. So looking at, well, how do we do that? How do we do it in an effective way? And how do we look at responsible gaming more proactively? Instead of being reactive to customers saying they have a problem and just trying to give them a brochure, how do we engage with them early on as a prevention mechanism from a responsible gaming perspective? How do we have conversations with them when there's concerns that would motivate behavioral change as a prevention mechanism? And really, it was early risk identification before risk identification was a thing. But it really was looking at the human experience of, there are people that experience problems. How do we help and support them? And then also, how do we engage with all customers in a proactive way to try to prevent problems from developing in the first place? And all of the programs and policies came from that genesis of how do we improve that customer experience.
So what's truly fascinating to me from what you just said is that top to the bottom, also bottom to the top approach, so a two-way traffic, as I presume that there are lots of, well beyond the gambling sector, lots of enterprises and businesses out there who would be claiming to listen to their folks. And this is what we'd like to do, and we've been inspired by our employees. So I would hope that there will be more practical examples of that two-way traffic approach. We should definitely wish Caesars the best of luck with their continued commitment, truly one of the leaders in the industry. You've touched upon Japan, and as you may recall, our very dear friend Alan Feldman has been the very first, I was going to say victim, let's stick to guest, of this podcast back in the day, and I truly didn't know what I was doing. He has also, throughout his career, he's been heavily involved with all things Japan, clear interest of the big US casino groups and, of course, others in that market. And you must have been to Japan a few times yourself, if not more than a few times. I've been twice, to my shame, I suppose. So would you agree that it's a fantastic country, but still somewhat shrouded in mystery, at least for us Westerners, for want of better expression? Or what's your take on Japan as a country?
I have been to Japan. So I consulted for Caesars for about 2.5 years in Japan. So I've been a few times. I love the country. I think it's a beautiful country, a beautiful people. The culture I'm fascinated by, and actually I think that again fed into RG and my perceptions of RG. That experience in Japan helped me realize that there is no one-size-fits-all message. There's no one-size-fits-all policy, that we need to really look at how do we make responsible gaming programs resonate with different demographics, different cultures, different belief systems, all of these things need to come into play when we're looking at creating effective programs. The story I'll share is, we were all, Alan and me and Jan Jones, all of us were over there talking about responsible gaming and the importance of responsible gaming. And we were putting out public messaging around responsible gaming before anything was even introduced, to try to set that foundation, that prevention foundation. I then looked at, I did some focus groups with actual Japanese citizens and showed them some of the collateral we had been using and the messaging we had been using. And what we found was it didn't make sense to them. None of it. So we had spent all this time as an industry talking about this really important concept, and we didn't realize that it wasn't resonating with the population because it didn't make sense. And it wasn't that it was translated poorly language-wise. It was culturally. It just didn't make sense. So we have to be very mindful and very, very respectful of different cultures when we start looking at how do we implement things that are going to be effective for them.
Oh, totally. And well, I suppose that applies to other jurisdictions, including the US, or the cultural idiosyncrasies up and down the country. We'll come on to that, but I presume what might work where I'm in New Jersey might not necessarily work out there in Nevada or Texas or other places. Talking about Nevada, although I suppose, and I apologize, I still might not have gotten the pronunciation quite right, despite having all the Vegas guests on the show. I'll work on that. That will be one of my New Year's resolutions, just like every single year. But I will, if I may, weave your university curriculum back in and all the research you've done, UNLV, RGC. So you have clearly served there in a variety of capacities, the International Gaming Institute, the Responsible Gambling Council. So the question I've got in this regard is, in your assessment, how important research still is in the gambling space these days? Because I suppose there are lots of cynical folks out there who might even go as far as arguing, look, a lot of that research, if not all of that research, has already been done. Are we implementing it? So that's my question, the importance of research for the future of our beloved industry.
Yes, research is crucial. Research is what's going to drive effective measures. We need to make sure that what we're putting in place is evidence-based, and we need to make sure that we have evaluation frameworks attached to what we're putting into place. Policy should really be flexible enough that it can adapt. If something's not working, it shouldn't be so rigid that we put it in place and it stays forever regardless. It should be, we're constantly evaluating and constantly adapting policy as we understand more. I will say, I think what's been problematic with research, and research, honestly, we are in early stages of research. There's a lot we don't know, especially in an online space, which is very different than a land-based environment. But research for the sake of research is not effective. So it's sort of like, as a researcher, I do research, I put it on the shelf, and I move on to the next project. That's not effective. What we really need is, attached to this research that we're doing, some way to translate that research into what is effective and actionable in a gaming environment. So what are we doing with that research? If we're using it to make actionable programs, things that we can actually implement and put into place, that's effective. If we're just doing research and then moving on to the next project and not really doing anything with that, then that's not very helpful. And I honestly think that's been the gap, is we're not looking at what is this research telling us, how can we create programs out of that, and how will they work? in a gaming environment. Because some ideas sound like really good ideas, but they want to actually work within a gaming environment. So we need to understand that as well.
Amen to that. Perhaps one brief counter. It's not necessarily me saying that, but what I tend to hear as well. But that's all fair. But research takes an awful lot of time. So, in your view, in your mind, is there a way of, for want of better expression yet again, cutting to the chase, speeding things up, without, of course, prejudicing the quality of the research, because that is critical?
I think it depends on what you're trying to determine. So there are research projects that can be done relatively quickly. There are some that are going to take more time. But understanding that sometimes we have to put things into place without that evidence base because policy has to move forward. That's why I really do stress the importance of evaluation frameworks. So if we're going to put it in place and we don't have an evidence base, then we need to make sure that we're evaluating it and the effect that it's actually having so that we can make sure that we're using the resources in the right way, that we're not either putting policies in place that are having no effect, or worse, we're putting policies in place that are having the absolute opposite effect of what we want, which we have seen in responsible gaming space. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember these policies affect people. And so we need to understand, what is that effect on people, and is it the effect that we want? And if it's not, we have to be able to get rid of those.
I'm delighted you brought up that point, because in my experience, on a very serious note, brushing my silly jokes aside, this is exactly what tends to get neglected both when it comes to conducting the research and its implementation. The patrons, the customers, what is it they think, and how will they react if a particular tool is implemented? Which hopefully is a nice segue to talk about the state of the union. Don't worry, this is not a political podcast, so we're not going to be talking egg prices and all that jazz. I mean the responsible gambling union. And in my book, you're in the absolutely perfect place and position to talk about the US and beyond, because besides being the executive director of Roga, you also are the president of the Nevada, there's the word again, Council on Problem Gambling. So, in your own words, what is your current take, or what is your take on the current responsible gambling landscape here in the States and even globally?
Well, I think it's important to remember that policy is affected by a lot of different things. So when we look at what's going on in other markets, and this harkens back to the Japan thing, that it's not as simple as plug and play, that what you do in one market, you're going to do in another market. Policy is affected by, perceptions of the role of government, public sentiment, the media, maturity of the market, culture, like all of these things contribute to policy. So in the U.S., I will say, especially around the online space, I think we've learned from other jurisdictions, and I do think you can see that the industry is taking a much more proactive role in responsible gaming. They are collaborating very much around this issue, hence the creation of the Responsible Online Gaming Association. And we're looking at how can we collectively have a bigger impact in responsible gaming than as individual companies. And I think that's an important step. And I think that's a really good move forward for the U.S. As we look at this, is how do we all play a role? Because this is a collaborative effort, not only of the industry, not only of the player. It's also researchers, it's policymakers, it's the players, people in recovery. Everyone plays a role. We all have the same end goal, and that's to protect the well-being of players. So how do we all do that together? And so I think those conversations are important of how are we doing that? And I think we're seeing that happen in the U.S.
If I may flip that question on its hat, what is it, and I appreciate the US being at it, I mean, when I say at it, sports betting for some 6, nearly 7 years, so compared to the European market, still a relatively young market, but then Brazil's just regulated. So the question is, what do you think the other jurisdictions, be it the more mature markets or the newbies, can actually learn from what's happened here in the States on the responsible gambling side of things?
Well, I think it goes back to the two things that we've talked about. One is making sure that they're getting evidence-based policies into place, and they're looking at culture, what's going to be right for their market. Collaboration, again, I would encourage across any jurisdiction, is making sure that there are a lot of different perspectives and voices involved, so that you come out with the best outcomes. But I think learning from other jurisdictions, but respecting the culture is very important.
Totally. With your crystal, I just realized that I do have a crystal ball behind me. If you don't have one, I'll ship it out west. But with your proverbial crystal ball, let's do some glazing. So how do you expect the US industry will shake up and shape on the RG front going forward, of course? And we'll talk about Roga next, ideally led by Roga.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, again, a lot of collective action. I think there's going to be a lot more innovation in the space, especially when you have, as Roga, you have 90% of the U.S. market by handle working together to try to come up with impactful initiatives. And I think that's where we're going to see the momentum, is that collaboration and working with a variety of stakeholders to move and innovate responsible gaming forward.
As I'm sure everybody knows, 8 leading, so 90% of the market, as you just said, 8 leading US industry gaming operators have formed a dedicated RG trade body, which largely was a novelty at that point, because we tend to stick to industry trade bodies and then encumber it with a lot of committees, including an RG committee. So this is a dedicated organization that is dedicated to responsible gambling, i.e. Roga Responsible Online Gaming Alliance. So could you tell us a little more about, although you've touched upon them, but specifically the objectives of the organizations, which programs you've launched by now, what are you looking into as
Certainly.
we speak?
Yeah, so we have 5 key pillars that we'll do a lot of different initiatives around. The first one is research. Research is really going to underpin most everything we do, but it's going to be research that actually drives initiatives, so that we're translating into actionable things, actionable programs. And then that's going to lead to evidence-based best practices. What is it that we all should be doing across the industry from a responsible gaming perspective? And that's not simply operate into compliance. That is, what are those standards that are the best practices? The third is we're really looking at education for a variety of different audiences. The first one we have launched is around college-age students, because looking at this is an age group that has this newfound freedom. Some of them are already involved in sports betting. Some of them may be in the future. And really getting a foundational knowledge of responsible gaming is important for this group. I think over the years, there's been a lot of focus on student athletes, which there should be, but the larger student population was kind of widely ignored. So that was really where we saw we could make a difference. And that one launched in February. It's called Know Your Play. Very excited about that one. And we have our partners, Epic, Kindbridge, and the Responsible Gambling Council that helped us create that. It's a digital website with digital tools and a lot of information around responsible gaming, but also around financial literacy, because this is an age group, again, that has this newfound financial freedom, and understanding financial literacy in general around savings, debt, limit setting. These are all important concepts in life, and also tied to responsible gaming. So even if they don't engage in sports betting or online gaming, these are important concepts for them. The fourth one that we're looking at is it's a data clearinghouse, and the first iteration of that will be a shared self-exclusion list across all Roga members across all jurisdictions. That one we have launched the RFP. We should be announcing the partner for that in a couple of weeks, so excited to tee that one up. And then the final one is a certification program. And that, again, is to set the U.S. standard for responsible gaming and to give assurances to regulators that those that get this certification meet these rigid standards, to also let players know that these are legal regulated sites and they meet these robust RG standards. And then from an operator perspective, to let them know where they're doing well, and then also where there's opportunities to improve and enhance what they're doing. And that one, we have the RFP. We're in the RFP process right now.
So clearly a lot of great work already being done and to be done. So if we were to look over the horizon of the nascent or already ongoing projects, what else you guys might have in store for us in the long run? I mean, conceptually, or if you could do anything you like, and hopefully that you will incur no ref from your members, they can channel it to me if that turns out to be an issue. But looking over the horizon conceptually, what is I suppose there's no end game, but some of the ultimate goals of Roga, or what are the top-notch projects that you might be considering to launch at some point, even if it was in a distant future?
Okay, I'll try to narrow this down to a couple.
Please do.
We have a time limit here. The first one I would say really is how to better integrate responsible gaming into the player experience. So instead of having sort of this standalone responsible gaming program, how do we just make it a part of that experience from a player from the time they enter into a platform until all of their play? So make that more streamlined and integrated. Second would be to change this perception that that these responsible gaming programs are problem gambling programs, that the intent of responsible gaming programs is that people who are experiencing problems should engage with these programs. Because the reality is responsible gaming programs are prevention programs that are targeted at the entire customer base. And largely what we see is this conflation of the two means that people tend not to engage in the programs because they think, well, these are for people that are experiencing problems. I don't have a gambling problem. This isn't for me. So changing that perception so we can really increase engagement with RG programs and RG tools. We know RG tools are helpful. We know they're useful if they're used. So really looking at how do we better position these programs to get more engagement with RG tools and programs. And then the third one I would say really is this. Well, I'll give 4. So the next one would be personalization. How do we personalize responsible gaming in a way that will resonate with different people? Because again, there's no one-size-fits-all message. So how do we make these resonate with different demographics, with different cultures, with different mindsets, quite frankly? So how do we make it more personalized than just this standard message for everyone? And then the fourth one would be related to the data clearinghouse. That one really is looking at how do we better share information around guests across operators so we have a more holistic view as opposed to a platform view. And how do we improve experiences or improve responsible gaming programs by having that wider view of a guest, especially, and that's why we're looking at self-exclusion first. So now, instead of just having someone say, I need to take a break from gambling, and this one platform knows that because that's the one they excluded from, now all operators will know this person needs to take a break from gaming, and that will be supported across all of the platforms.
You've heard it here first. We'll be intently watching the space, wishing Roga and Jen the best of luck in their very commendable efforts. In essence, if I got the message correctly, in an ideal world, when it comes to RG tools, we would go from nuisance, or if you will, perceived nuisance, to a no-brainer. I'm happy to sell that slogan to anyone who might care for it, from nuisance to no-brainer, but I shall digress now. And before Jen faces the rather tedious, but at the same time annoying task to have 60 seconds to deliver her key messages, let's talk about sports in good old Las Vegas. And especially the American audience of this podcast will know that the major league teams, they tend to move from one place to another. I happen to be an Atlanta Braves fan. They used to be Boston Braves. And examples abound. Yet, at least lately, it would appear that all the sports roads, they're not leading to Rome. They lead into Las Vegas. Formula One, Golden Knights, here's Ellen Feldman, all over. Again, the Raiders. You get in a baseball team, and I'm sure before we know it, LeBron will crystallize and implement his idea of launching an NBA franchise in Las Vegas. So here's the question. Why do you think that is? And when indeed that's part of the crystal ball glazing, we can expect LeBron to come to town.
I think for a long time, Las Vegas, Nevada, has been really an entertainment capital for a variety of reasons. It's been sort of America's playground, if I may, and I think that sports is a natural part of that. I think we're now seeing really it's becoming a sports hub. It was very, I would say, experimental when we brought over the Knights, and I have to share my golden Knights. That seeing the support that they received here in Las Vegas was overwhelming. It's a great experience. It's a great arena. It's really loud. We really love our Knights. And then I think that extended as we brought in new teams, the excitement, and it brings a lot of people here. And now that sports betting is being embraced across a lot of the U.S., it also brings in that excitement of coming to the games, being able to see shows, go to all the restaurants, play on the slots, do some sports betting. It's just all encompassed. And then we also have beautiful mountains and lakes and wonderful things here.
And great people. And even my wife, I can guarantee you, who doesn't care a single iota about hockey, especially when I watch it on TV, she loved the Knights experience when I took her to a couple of games. But here we go. Your 60 seconds, please, to convey your key messages. They may be about hockey, but I suppose ideally about responsible gambling, please.
Sure. Well, I think that I would say over my career, I've been driving this data-driven approach to responsible gaming, and I still think that holds true, that everything that we're doing should be evidence-based. We should be creating evidence-based best practices. We should be evaluating what we're doing and making sure that what we're doing is effective. We should be looking at how do we innovate in this space, especially around online gaming, where we can directly interact with guests along the entire play experience. So how do we integrate responsible gaming into that play experience? And how do we educate those that are either newly engaging within sports betting or gaming to do it in a way that is responsible? So how do we set that responsible gaming framework and foundation? And we're doing that at Roga through things like our Know Your Play campaign for that specific audience of college-age students. We'll continue to look at different audiences as we progress. But very exciting initiatives that are out there all around collaboration, all around innovation, and all around protecting player well-being and improving responsible gaming programs.
Thank you very much for coming onto the show. Thank you even more so for all your service to the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jennifer Shatley, shaping the future of the U.S. responsible gambling space out of Nevada. My name is Martin Lycka. This has been the latest episode of your Safe Bet Show, and I shall see you next time. Thank you very much.